I opened up these social media accounts some years ago, initially a couple of them just because I was interested in the internet. And that's when people were actually talking about the internet as if it was exciting. Um, I won't say how far back. And then I thought I would open a lot of multiple social media accounts to promote my books when I started publishing, and I've hardly done that. I have done a little bit, but not a lot. So I have 4 potential really interesting projects coming out next year. One's going to be on heavy metal. I'll have a second one on David Bowie. I'll have a graphic novel and hopefully a illustrated collection of poems. The illustrations are by my friend Lee Fernside. I don't know when or if for sure they'll come out, but all 4 of them could potentially come out next year. So I thought I would take this little gap here to actually talk about the books I already have out. I'll kind of talk about what they're about and how I came up with the idea for them, and you can decide if you're interested in them. They're mostly going to be academic books. So if you think they're worthy of attention or interest, you might consider ordering them for your college or university library or your local public library. They're all pretty expensive because they're academic books. Let me show you the one I'm going to talk about today. My first one, Blake and Kierkegaard, Creation and Anxiety. I think it's like 200 pages, and it sells for $125 in hardback. And the electronic version it's like $48. Get it in an EPUB or PDF file. And that's because academic books are very well made. You might notice there's no dust jacket. The cover image is imprinted on the cover. It has library binding and acid-free paper. It's designed to sit on a library shelf for 100 years and to only mostly sell to libraries. I'm looking at this. April 19th, 2010 is when I received this copy of this book. I have the invoice in there still. So that was my first book. It was published around the middle of 2010. It's kind of based on my dissertation, but it was massively revised from my dissertation. I took one chapter out from my dissertation. I added one that wasn't in there before. I rearranged the chapters. The order is different, and it was extensively edited. And I have to thank, to this day, this was 15 years ago, but I have to thank the person who was my department chair then, Dr. Sherry Truffin, for editing that book for me. And she went through 3 rounds of edits, okay? While I was rewriting it and editing it, I'd print out a chapter, give it to her. She'd go through it, make her edits, and explain to me why she was editing it the way she was. So we were conferencing about it. And she gave me a book to read. I think it's Alan Richardson. It's called Style. And her work with me really turned the corner on my writing. My writing is much better now because of her efforts than it was at the time. And this is after I had my PhD in English. I'm revising my dissertation. I still needed that kind of guidance. And I tell this story to my writing students now. I needed that guidance. So, of course, you need it too. You're not even English majors, much less have a PhD. So we all need help. We all need help with our writing. That's what I tell everybody. And she gave me that help, and I'm still grateful for it. I bought her a Kindle for her work. Her long-suffering work, and I'm still grateful for. And she's an accomplished scholar in Gothic literature herself, and she has at least one book out. So you might want to check out her work as well. This book, I had the idea for this book before, or right around the time I started graduate school in 1999. August of 1999 is when I started graduate coursework. And in my family, and at the time, we got really interested in The Matrix, the first Matrix movie when it came out. And it's embarrassing to say how many times we went to Oviedo Commons in Florida and saw it. And probably, I don't know, 7 times. I don't know. There's a pig there. We'd all say hi to the pig, maybe rub its head or something, and then go upstairs and see the movie. We were just all really sucked into that, the myth of the Matrix. And it's, in a sense, it's a myth that's kind of universal to world religions and philosophies. It's a myth that explores. And just to clarify myself, I'm not using the word myth in a sense that it's an untrue story. It's a story that tries to tell the truth. The events of the mythical work may not be literal truth, but it's trying to tell a truth about the human condition, about human life and experience. And I believe the Matrix movie is tapping into a common element in many world myths and philosophies, and that's the relationship between the material world and the world of the mind, I guess you could say. And there's a line in there. I think Morpheus says, how do you know if you're dreaming or awake? And that's the subject of one of Plato's dialogues, and they never answer the question. I think Socrates ends the discussion by saying, we'll have to revisit this question later. So that's the main thing. But the other thing about the Matrix is that human beings create this supercomputer that gains consciousness. It becomes sentient and self-aware. It's a willing, thinking being, and not just a computer running programs, no matter how sophisticated the programs are. And invariably, as it seems to always do in that particular kind of myth, which we see in, say, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as the grandmother of modern science fiction, I would say. And she's current. Benicio del Toro just did an interesting kind of rewriting adaptation of her novel. Very close in some ways, but thematically it's very different. In some ways, I should say. The creation turns on us and destroys us and enslaves us. Human beings try to escape control by the computer by nuking it and sending clouds of particles in the air to block sunlight because they're solar powered. So the computer just started growing human beings in these gel-filled pods and used us all like we were copper-top batteries to provide its power source. And that's the Matrix, that computer program that our consciousness is connected to, that fools us into thinking we're living in a real material world when we're just living and growing in a gel-filled pod to feed a computer. And the point is to wake up from this illusion, this veil, this illusion. So you can look at veil imagery across religions from the Hebrew scriptures, just everything, or the idea of Maya in Buddhism, illusion, and this is frequently developed. But the side myth, the Frankenstein story, I just realized, at the time when I was watching it, it's a retelling of Frankenstein. And here's where we're getting to the point of my book. I asked myself, why do we always imagine this is going to go bad? I mean, every time, It starts with RUR, and it starts with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but that's a biological creation. And then RUR, which is where I believe then it was called Czechoslovakia, now it's the Czech Republic. It was a play, and the word robot comes from that. And then the film Metropolis from the early 20th century, which is an amazing film still. It is a great film. If you haven't seen Metropolis, watch it. And on and on and on, these creations turn against their creators and attack or destroy humanity. And I just ask myself, why do we imagine that? Why? Okay. So my original idea for my dissertation, I start graduate school with that idea. And then I take Cassandra Laedy's literary theory course in the spring of 2000, I believe. It was a great course. She was a great teacher. And we read Baudrillard's Simulacrum and Simulation, which was required reading for the Matrix. And I read it, and I wrote a paper about it, and I kept updating that and like publishing shorter versions of it. I may have published a really short version online just based on the first movie before I wrote my final paper for that grad school class, which is a long version of the paper, which I kept updating until all the Matrix films had come out, until the most recent one, which is less a contribution to the myth of the Matrix and the Wachowski brothers complaining that they had to make the movie to begin with. And it was a glorious complaint, the Wachowskis, I should say. I really appreciate making that movie and complaining about having to make the movie while they were making it. It's wonderful use of film. So that's not included, but I finally wrote a final version of that grad school paper, and based on all the Matrix movies. It was the Animatrix, the three main Matrix movies, and maybe some other things I don't remember. And I published it in the International Journal of Baudrillard Studies, and as long as that's still up, it's open access, it's still there, you can find it. But that was a germ of my idea for this book, Blake and Kierkegaard, Creation and Anxiety. My name for that fear that if we were to create something, it would turn on us, was creation anxiety. I think the publishers didn't like that in the title, so we did Blake and Kierkegaard, Creation and Anxiety, but the term creation anxiety is throughout the book. And looking back, it's a really weirdly organized book. One thing that I was annoyed with in grad school was the adaptation of these theoretical paradigms that originate in one historical context, and their application to literary works or other creative works that come from originating in completely different historical contexts. And it doesn't bother me that people were doing it, it's that they bothered me that they were doing it without reflecting on it. Provide a justification. Why do you think psychoanalytic theory applies to this? Because surely you don't think psychoanalytic theory is real, right? No one does. But that doesn't mean it's an interesting way that the human mind thinks about its own construction. Wittgenstein said, for example, psychoanalytic theory was a myth, but what a glorious myth, Again, it's a way that the mind has of understanding itself. So it may be relevant and applicable on those terms, but think about it, talk about why does it apply? So it's a 5-chapter book, I believe. I don't even remember. I probably should have read it. It's dedicated to my wife at the time, Sheridan, the thwarted goddess of commas. And our first big argument was over the necessity of a comma before a dependent clause at the beginning, following a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence. We were dating, and there were really hurt feelings involved. She was saying it's a rule, and I was saying it's an option. And the way it worked out, I had 4 of those grammar books on my shelf from different publishers, and 2 of them said it was a rule, and one of them didn't, and one of them probably didn't even mention it. So since there wasn't a uniform presentation of it as a rule, I technically won the argument, but in my opinion, but I was arguing with my girlfriend, and that means I lost the argument. It's just a bad idea. We did go on to get married. We have 3 children together, and 25 years after the argument, we're divorced. And I blame that argument over commas. Anyways, yes, my book has, and she was a valuable reader of my first book too. She's Sheridan was a history major, and I was making and this is part of what I'm going to say about the book, a historically based argument to bring Blake and Kierkegaard together. And she said, look, if you're going to talk about the historical stuff, you might as well make it explicit and organize it. And that was a source of that piece of advice was a source of a major idea I had for chapter 1. Okay. So what the book does is set up theoretical approaches and historical approaches to the two authors that justifies my bringing them together, and then shared thematic context, and that's in the first 3 chapters. In the 4th chapter, shared thematic context, and the 5th chapter is actually about creation anxiety. So I have 4 chapters of setup for 1 chapter of argument about the actual topic of the book. And so the book is as much about reading literature and the way we read literature and why we read it the way we do, as it is about the literary works themselves. And I had one review. It's been reviewed several times. I would say it's my most successful book by this metric. It's in 1,500 libraries more around the world. It was published by Continuum in 2010. Continuum was a wonderful press. It's probably best known for publishing the 33 1/3 book series. And then it was acquired by Bloomsbury, and it failed to exist, ceased to exist as Continuum. But Continuum published some really great cutting-edge scholarship on Kierkegaard that I loved, and on other things. The editors were really looking for creative ideas for book projects, and I miss them. I'm sure Bloomsbury's carrying that forward in its own way, but I do miss Continuum, and I was proud to be published with them. So the 5 chapters, the first chapter is shared context. And the idea is that there's sources for creation anxiety in William Blake's work. And what I'm doing is I'm using William Blake's First Book of Your Reason for the creation bit and Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety for the anxiety bit. And I was once talking to the president of the small liberal arts college in Northern Ohio. No, well, it was, yeah, Northern Ohio, just south of the Michigan border, I think. He was a great guy. Really enjoyed talking to him. He was looking at my publications, and he looked at this book and he said, "So you literally did the most difficult thing you could possibly do." And that told me he really knew what he was talking about. He was familiar with these works. I really admired him for that, because concept of anxiety is notoriously Kierkegaard's most difficult work. The translators complain about its difficulty. People reading it in Danish complain about its difficulty. It's crazy. It's like and interestingly, his philosophical works are called his poetic works because they're written by fictional authors. He ascribes a pseudonym to them. This was originally conceived by him as a formal study of anxiety, theological and psychological. And philosophical, but at the last minute, he assigned a pseudonym for it, Vigilius Hofniensis, the Watchman of Copenhagen. So I talk about the shared historical and cultural context between Denmark and England. William Blake's and Søren Kierkegaard's lives do overlap somewhat. Blake lived 1757 to 1827, and Kierkegaard lived 1813 to 1855, if I recall correctly. They were both, Denmark has a significant chunk of land Jutland connected to the European continent, but its main cultural center is an island. And Copenhagen, the capital, is on the island. And that's where the king resided, and that's where the major university was. So in many ways, England and Denmark shared being an island nation, dependent upon its navy for its survival and trade. And Jutland, I think, was mostly farmland at the time. And they had a lot of things in common that I talk about in chapter 1, and I explain that these cultural tensions that they shared in common. Let's see. Let's see. I won't summarize it. I should have read the book again. I don't remember what I said. Kind of. There's 3 cultural tensions that I describe in chapter 1 that I establish a historical basis for Blake and Kierkegaard to have shared. And that's my justification for using Kierkegaard to interpret Blake, and I think we need to do more of that. One of my reviewers, she missed something about the book. She said I brought up these cultural tensions in chapter 1 that I never mentioned again, but I do use them. I employ them in chapter 5. They're very important there. So maybe she just didn't read to the end. I don't know. But she was also the only reviewer who, and I will say another reviewer following up on her work corrected that. He said, yes, he does talk about this in chapter 5. And I was grateful for that too. But she was also the only reviewer that observed that I was engaged in a different way of reading literature. I was trying to provide a historical basis for my theoretical approach. That's the point. And that's that whole process is the point of my second book in my next video here. And I do that work in chapter 1, and then I talk about shared philosophical context in chapter 2 with the Socratic tradition. And I have another article on Blake and Kierkegaard and Socrates that was published in Robert Rix's collection on Kierkegaard and literature with Northwest University Press. And if I could, I would take that chapter and make it chapter 3 in this book if I was able to publish a second edition of this book, because it fits right in. I talk about Blake, Kierkegaard, and the Socratic tradition, and that chapter in Robert Rix's anthology develops that idea. And what's really interesting about the two of them is that they both had a Moravian background. And I talk about the history of Moravianism and how it lies at the heart, as it provided the starting point for Methodism in England. And I talk all about that, not in this book, but in that chapter in Kierkegaard, Literature and the Arts by Northwest University Press. And then chapter 3 is Blake, Kierkegaard, and a classical model of personality, and how they both seemed to theorize the human personality in terms of a tripartite model. One person criticized me for saying, that's really a minority position, and he's right. I should have mentioned that in the book. The Catholic Church, I'm talking about body, soul, and spirit, and that's a tripartite model. The Catholic Church officially in the Catechism and has, I think, believed this for, I don't know, hundreds of years, if not 1,000 or more, that soul and spirit are just two words for the same thing. But in the tripartite model, there are three things. And in a tripartite model of human anthropology is built into William Blake. It's built into Kierkegaard, the concept of anxiety, at least, with somatic, pneumatic, and oh my God, and psyche. Psyche, pneuma, and soma are the Greek words he uses for psyche would be mind, soma would be body, and pneuma would be spirit. And it's built into Plato, the allegory of the cave. And the three positions of the prisoners are trapped in chains at the bottom of the cave. They're illuminated by firelight on the path leading out of the cave, and then they experience the full light of the sun when they leave the cave. So a bodily consciousness, if your mind is determined by your bodily experiences, that's somatic. It's a bodily oriented personality. And you're like the prisoners at the bottom of the cave, just seeing shadows against the wall. And then when you become educated in using human institutions and human structures, law, religion, politics, formal education, just socialization, philosophy. You're walking by humanly generated light, the firelight along the path. And that would be soul or psyche, okay? And then you walk into the full divine light of reason. And you're illuminated directly by God, and that would be pneuma, or spirit, which in Plato was reason, but in Christianity is somewhat something else. And to medieval Christians, it was something else. But they were both working with that, and I demonstrate that in chapter 3. And then we have to talk about reproduction in terms of generation, the anxieties related to reproduction and growth and all of that, because the idea is we're born a somatic, a bodily personality. We're educated in psyche and in the soul, and then we grow up into spiritual beings, ideally, in this model. And in Plato and Socrates, his first and most important dialogue, the life of the philosopher is lived to detach from the body. So death is not something to be feared or loathed. It's our final freedom. Now, the thing is, Christian anthropology rejects that because it accepts the physical body as being good and created by God. So body, soul, and spirit are supposed to be integrated with spirit in the lead. And Kierkegaard describes different personality types throughout his philosophical works, his poetic works, his pseudonymous authorship, as being in different states. It could be asleep, and the body could be running things, or you could be an aesthetic personality. You're bodily oriented, but maybe you're very intelligent and creative, and you control that. And I show how that's all reflected in Blake in chapter 3, and then how that reflects on imagination and creation and procreation in chapter 4. And I'm pretty sure Plato's Symposium comes in there, where Diotima, the consort, the escort, a prostitute, is talking about the 3 ways that men seek immortality, and that's through procreation, and that's through, if I recall, really should read these books before I talk about it. I have read it, of course, hundreds of times while I was editing it, but it's been years. And then through human institutions is the second way, and that'd be the soul, and then through philosophy, and that would be spirit. So she was working with a tripartite model as well, and of course Plato was not limited to a tripartite model. So that doesn't exhaust his authorship on the topic, but I talk about the points of contact that do exist. And finally, I bring in creation anxiety. I bring all of that together in creation anxiety in the first book of Your Reason. And Your Reason is a creator monarch. One of the tensions that Denmark and England had in common was with their monarchy and its place. The monarchy was an absolute monarchy in Denmark, but it was something like a constitutional monarchy in England. It was a king in parliament that wielded power, not the king alone. And I talk about the demonic and spiritlessness, which is a huge section in concept of anxiety and a good way to reflect on the character of your reason. And the 3 cultural tensions, the political, cultural tensions between science and religion, and between nature and artifice and creation, are discussed in their turn in chapter 5. So this is a philosophic way of reading literature. And I justify the philosophy by pointing out a shared historical and philosophical context between the two authors. Both historical and philosophical shared context justifies the connection between those two authors. That's my new way of reading literature. I don't just apply some theoretical paradigm. I justify its use historically. And that becomes a basis of my second book, and I'll talk about that in the next video. If you've watched this far, thanks for sticking with me.